So, in the very first lecture, we talked about all kinds of things that are um, able to hurt you. So, we talked about all kinds of pathogens like bacteria and fungi and viruses, all kinds of things that, if they were to get into your body, then can possibly affect you. We also talked about predators, so things like lions and tigers, that if they were to eat you, you'd be kind of out of luck. But there's all kinds of conditions that your body can't really deal with in the extremes. So we can't deal with, say, water for without 2 weeks, being without water for 2 weeks, or eating incredible amounts of sugar, or being incredibly hot or incredibly cold. Because the systems of your body, the interior of your body, doesn't like those things. And so your body needs to be able to regulate itself so that the interior of your body can stay right at the condition that it needs to. So your body regulates itself by a system of homeostatic mechanisms that keep, say, your blood sugar in the right range, your body temperature in the right range, so that your cells, organs, and tissues can all do exactly what they need to do. So homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively constant environment in the body. So you have, again, exterior structures like skin and mucus and eyelashes and all kinds of things that are trying to keep things that don't need to be in your body away from the inside of your body. But you also need these interior mechanisms to make sure that all of your body systems run as efficiently as possible. So what happens when these homeostatic mechanisms fail or are dysregulated? So say your body temperature gets too high, or your blood sugar gets too high, and they aren't able to come down. We end up with physiological disease or death. So in the example of, if your blood sugar gets too high, sometimes people go into a coma, which is the way that your body attempts to bring that blood sugar back down. If your body temperature gets too high, you run a fever, which is your body trying to fight off bacteria or virus that is causing you to have this high body temperature. But if eventually your homeostatic mechanisms don't re-regulate, then you die. So homeostatic mechanisms are really important for maintaining the health of the interior of your body. So this week we're going to talk both generally about homeostasis and feedback loops. So mechanisms that are ways that we can think about how systems regulate themselves. And we're going to think about it in the specific instance of blood sugar. And then next week, we're going to talk about what happens when blood sugar is dysregulated for an extended period of time. So again, homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively constant environment in the body, and this is important for all organ systems, especially the nervous system, so that's your brain and nerves, and endocrine system, which is your hormones. And we're going to talk about what hormones are later in this lecture. So we gave some examples already. But examples of homeostasis within the body include temperature, blood pressure, pH, and glucose concentration. And each of these has a special range that they're supposed to be in. So your temperature should be right around 37 degrees. Your blood pressure should be roughly under 120 over 80. Your pH in your body should be like 7.6 or so. And the glucose concentration in your blood should be between 80 and 120. And those are all in different units, but just pointing out that those are pretty limited ranges that your body system should be functioning at. So let's give the example of blood pressure. So somebody with hypertension is someone who has high blood pressure. And often this happens because, say, somebody's had a lot of cholesterol. And cholesterol that comes maybe from really fatty foods ends up building up in people's blood vessels. And so their veins and their arteries end up with this level, like coating of cholesterol. And that cholesterol makes it harder for the blood to get through. And because of this, the blood pressure increases and increases and increases. And blood pressure increasing is a sign that other things are going wrong in the body, because it's a sign that cholesterol is building up in the veins and arteries. And this can be a major risk factor for things like heart disease and also stroke. And so, or say that your temperature is much higher or much lower than it's supposed to be, then your body is going to attempt to regulate your temperature in order to bring it back to the pretty narrow range that it likes to exist in. So we have two types of feedback loops, and right now they're going to seem a little abstract, but hopefully as we keep going through them a couple times over, then you'll get what we mean by them. So a positive feedback loop enhances change. So if one entity goes up, then the other entity also goes up. And it brings the system away from equilibrium. So if equilibrium is where we want to be in terms of wanting to stay the same and wanting to stay at a given value, then it brings the value away from that. So a negative feedback loop is the opposite. So it dampens change, it brings down change and decreases change. And it brings the system back towards equilibrium. So it brings it towards that control that we've set. So again, these might seem a little abstract, but we're going to flesh them out. So an example of a positive feedback loop is population and births per year. So if your population increases, then, so say you have a large influx of immigrants into a country, that would increase the population. Those immigrants, as well as everyone else in the population, are going to have more kids. And by having more births per year, those people will then become part of the population, and eventually they'll have their own kids. And so the population is going to increase. And so as they have their own kids, those are more births per year. Those are more people in the population increases. So as population increases, births also increase, that which increases population, which increases births, and so on and so on. So this is taking the population away from equilibrium. It's away from the starting value that we started with and wanted, and it's spiraling. It's continuing to go up and up and up. A negative feedback loop is a little bit more complicated. So this is a thermostat. So say the thermostat in your house, you've set to 25 degrees. And so the room temperature is below 25 degrees. And then your thermostat sees, the room temperature is below 25 degrees. And so then the thermostat is going to turn on the furnace. And by turning the furnace on, the room temperature is going to rise. And then you have to ask the question, is the room temperature still below 25 degrees C? And if it's still below 25 degrees C, then the thermostat, which is set at 25 degrees C, will turn the furnace on and the room temperature will rise. And again, you must ask, is the room temperature below 25 degrees C? And so on and so on. And so you can see the way that the negative feedback loop is trying to bring your equilibrium to this value that is set by our sensor. So it's trying to regulate a system and bring it to this equilibrium, whereas a positive feedback loop is bringing away from equilibrium. So again, to just a little bit more detail, a positive feedback loop just says the higher A is means the higher B is, means the higher A is, means the higher B is. So again, the higher the population, the more births per year, because there's more people having kids. More kids means that there are more people. They count too. There are more people. And so on, the population will continue growing in this way. So we're working away from equilibrium. We're working away from this population that we started with, and continuing to go up and up and up and up and up. So as we've said, many of the mechanisms in the body want to stay at homeostasis. There aren't very many examples of systems that want to work away from homeostasis unless the body wants to be in two different states. And one of these states is labor and delivery. And so again, a positive feedback loop is that increasing A leads to an increase in B, which leads into an increase in A, which leads into an increase in B. We're working away from equilibrium. And a great example of this, again, is labor and delivery. So we're going to start here. The brain stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin, which is a hormone, which is carried in the bloodstream to the uterus. It stimulates uterine contractions, which pushes the baby towards the cervix, and the baby pushes against the cervix, which means that nerve impulses from the cervix transmit to the brain, which causes the brain to release oxytocin again. And so the brain releases oxytocin, which stimulates contractions, which means that the baby pushes against the cervix, which releases more oxytocin. So increased oxytocin means increased contractions, means more pressure on the cervix, which means more oxytocin. So in the same way, we're working away from equilibrium, we're working away from homeostasis because we want to end in a different state than we started. We want to end with the baby out of their mother's body. And so we're working away from equilibrium. A negative feedback loop is a little bit more complicated. It has 4 distinct parts. One is the stimulus, which is the condition that we start with. One is the sensor that determines where we're supposed to be, what is the homeostasis that we're working towards, and senses that and triggers a control. A control is what we change in order to get towards homeostasis, and the effector is what happens because the control was changed. So in this example, we have the stimulus, which is the temperature below 25 degrees. The sensor is the thermostat, which is at 25 degrees. And so the thermostat determines whether or not the temperature is at 25 degrees. Since in this case it's not, the sensor triggers the control. The control turns the furnace on. Turning the furnace on contributes to this effect, that the room temperature rises. Since the room temperature has risen, we have to ask a question. Is the initial statement that we had true? Is this initial stimulus still true? So, say that you started at 23 degrees, and during this cycle, the room temperature rises to 24 degrees. If you ask the question here, then yes, 24 degrees is still below 25 degrees, and the cycle will continue because we're working towards 25 degrees. If you are at 25 degrees or above 25 degrees, then this system will stop because you've reached homeostasis. So you can see that we're working towards homeostasis rather than away from homeostasis. We're working towards this value. Here's a kind of bad joke. Why is there negative feedback from your biology teacher? Because she's teaching homeostasis this week. What do you expect? Hope you enjoyed that little joke. So in the second half of this lecture, we're going to talk about a specific negative feedback loop. It's really 2 negative feedback loops nested within each other, and this is the control of blood sugar in your body.